We're very pleased to have our presenter. I'm going to introduce the presenter that we have today, as well as our resource person who will be taking questions at the end. So our presenter is Bina Feldman. She's worked in the field of adult education for over 30 years. She was the principal of her own company, delivering training and development seminars nationally and internationally. Bina is a retired professional trainer, consultant performance coach, and keynote speaker. She's pleased to be part of Dying with Dignity Canada and to be contributing to educate the public about medical assistance in dying and advanced care planning. Resource person Virginia Flintoft is a retired senior researcher in health policy and patient safety at the University of Toronto and a recent member of the Education and Community Outreach Committee of the Toronto chapter of Dying with Dignity. She has been a board member of the Cancer Quality Council of Ontario and the Toronto York Victorian Order of Nurses. Her background in intensive care nursing has reinforced her commitment to the importance of education as critical to individuals and their families to make informed end-of-life decisions. So thank you so much for being here, both of you.
Okay.
And I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Sequoia, and welcome to all. In our culture, we seldom talk about death. It's almost as if the subject is taboo. Today, we are going to talk about death, specifically medical assistance in dying. The information included in today's presentation is medical assistance in dying, and this information is timely and accurate as of the date presented, which today is October 15th, 2024. If you're watching a recorded version at a later date, please note that subsequent changes to relevant legislation or regulation may affect the accuracy of the content. My mother died at the age of 101, and she played bridge on her second to last day. She often said to me, "Bina, you have to be lucky in life and lucky in death." And she was one of the lucky ones. But we all know not everyone is that lucky. She told me she wasn't afraid to die, that dying was a natural part of life. And when my time comes, I shouldn't be afraid either. What an amazing gift she gave me in telling me that, and one that I've shared with my own children. It's time we all started to get more comfortable talking about death and dying. Medical assistance in dying is a complex topic, and we're going to have a lot of information in today's presentation. But if you remember one thing, and one thing only out of everything I'm going to say today, I want you to remember this. If you have knowledge of the options available to you, you can make informed choices in your planning and decision-making, and you'll ultimately have more control of your end-of-life situation. That's what I want you to remember. Knowledge of your options gives you more control. Our agenda for today is as follows. We're going to tell you a little bit about Dying with Dignity Canada, our organization. What are the end-of-life options? Specifically, what is medical assistance in dying according to the law? How it became legal in Canada? What's new and what's coming up on the horizon for this legislation? And then we'll take your questions. So in terms of our organization, it's called Dying with Dignity Canada. And today, Virginia and I are part of the GTA chapter. We are a human rights charity with over 130,000 members across Canada. We started in Ontario and grew to a national organization. And in 2020, we celebrated our 40th anniversary. What do we do? We advocate for assisted dying rules that respect the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have very little government funding. We're funded by average Canadians who are looking for a better way to die. In a recent Ipsos Reid poll, 86% of Canadians approved of medical assistance in dying for those who qualify. And that's a very important part, the qualification. So I'm going to tell you about that in a few minutes. How do we work? We support and we intervene in court challenges related to Bill C-14. That's the legislation that allows for MAID. And we work to ensure that doctors will refer people who want information about MAID, even if they themselves don't approve of MAID. They're obliged in Ontario, they're obliged by law to refer you, if you're asking, for the information and the support you need. So at Dying with Dignity Canada, we offer support, educational programs like this one here today, advocacy work in government. We offer personal and emotional support to anyone who's seeking information about MAID. So our focus is fourfold. At Dying with Dignity Canada, we're interested in eligibility, who's eligible for MAID, access to MAID. We offer support and education, as I mentioned. Okay, the purpose of this slide is to put MAID in context. It starts over at the far left where you see conventional medical care. All of us have had that since we were young children. And as we move toward the end of life, it's important that we have options and that we know what these options are. And broadly speaking, they include conventional medicine at the top, maybe even Eastern medicine, which is less conventional here in North America, hospice and palliative care, medical assistance in dying for those who qualify, and a number of other options such as do not resuscitate orders, voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, going to Switzerland for medical assistance in dying, which is the only country that allows non-residents to access it. But I want you to note that these circles are not standing alone. They're all overlapping. So there's a lot of overlap with, for example, medical assistance in dying and palliative care. All of these options provide us the best possible care in Canada. At the bottom, you see advanced care planning in this line across the whole slide. It's a process over time, and I believe that Vaughn has offered a presentation on advanced care planning. It helps us to understand and make decisions about our end of life and appoint a substitute decision maker who will be able to step in if we can no longer speak for ourselves and interact with the medical team. So it is a complex topic, but we're going to move forward and make it more simple for you to understand. This is the legal definition according to our law. What is medical assistance in dying, or called MAID? The administration of a substance by a physician or a nurse practitioner at the person's request that causes death. Or the prescription or providing substance to a person, again, on request for self-administration to cause their death. So it's important to know that it's only when the person raises their hand and says, "This is what I want," that we can move forward with MAID. Here are three brave women who paved the way. And at the far left, the youngest woman is Sue Rodriguez. And if you were around in the 90s, maybe you heard about her. She lived in British Columbia. She was 42 years old, suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. And she wanted to have assistance in her death, and it was against the law. She took her case to the Supreme Court of Canada, and she asked them, "If I cannot give consent to my own death, whose body is this?" They debated, but they upheld the criminal code even in a 5-4 decision, but still it remained a crime in 1993 to assist someone in their death. In any event, the next year, Sue Rodriguez did take her own life with the help of an anonymous physician, and she passed away. Fast forward 20 years, we meet Kay Carter in the center and Gloria Taylor on the far right. Gloria Taylor had ALS like Sue Rodriguez, and Kay Carter had degenerative spinal stenosis. And these women fought bravely on behalf of all Canadians for the right to die with dignity. Regrettably, neither of them lived to see the fruits of their labor. Kay Carter had an assisted death in Switzerland in 2010. As I mentioned, she couldn't get it in Canada, but she was able to get it in Switzerland. And Gloria Taylor died of a severe infection in 2012. But Kay Carter took her case to the Supreme Court, and in February 2015, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the prohibition on assisted dying infringes on an individual's right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So back in 1993, it was a 5-4 decision against, but in February 2015, it was a unanimous decision to allow for MAID. And so the resulting MAID legislation became Bill C-14, and maybe you've read about it. It was brought into law in June 2016. That's when it became legal in Canada. And since then, over 45,000 Canadians have accessed medical assistance in dying to relieve them from intolerable pain and suffering. Who is eligible for MAID in Canada? This is a very important slide, the very important information. You have to be eligible. What does that mean? You have to be eligible for publicly funded health services, which in Ontario is OHIP. You have to be 18 years of age and mentally competent, the ability to make your own healthcare decisions. You have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. That's kind of a mouthful, so I'm going to describe it again on the next slide, what that means. You have to be making this request voluntarily. Nobody must be coercing you. Not your children, not your spouse, not your brother or sister. Nobody. You have to be making this request on your own. And just before the procedure is performed, you have to be able to give informed consent. So right before they perform MAID, they ask you, are you sure you want to go through with this? And you have to be clear of mind, and you have to be able to say yes. Or you can say no and change your mind. But what is a grievous and irremediable medical condition? That's an incurable illness, disease, or disability in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. You have to be experiencing an unbearable physical or mental suffering from this illness or disease and be in a state of decline that cannot be relieved under any conditions that you find acceptable to you. And your natural death has to be reasonably foreseeable. So these are pretty strict criteria. You have to be suffering unbearably. Your natural death has to be in short order. You have to be clear of mind. And so let's look further at what all this means. Well, in 2019, that was 2016 that I just talked to you about. In 2019, these two Quebecers, Jean Truchon and Nicole Gladue, were living in Quebec, and they satisfied all the criteria that were necessary to apply for MAID. But their natural death was not reasonably foreseeable. See that last bullet in red. They thought that that wasn't fair, so they took their case to the Supreme Court of Quebec, and they asked that the court decide on that last criteria. and the court sided with them. And the Quebec Supreme Court said that the criterion, you have to have your natural death be reasonably foreseeable in order to access MAID, was in fact unconstitutional. And so the federal government agreed with the Quebec court, and they changed the criminal code. And so now this very important decision made a big impact on the whole MAID community, because now we had two tracks of applicants for MAID, one whose natural death was reasonably foreseeable, and others like Jean Touchant and Nicole Gladue, whose natural death was not reasonably foreseeable. Jean Touchant was suffering from cerebral palsy, and Nicole Gladue from post-polio syndrome. Why was this issue, your natural death has to be reasonably foreseeable, why was it such a sticky point? Let's explore that just briefly. Well, the reason that the Quebec government, the Quebec Supreme Court cut it down was that it was hard for doctors to interpret that, and it could be different from doctor to doctor, deciding if your natural death was reasonably foreseeable. So there was inconsistency in how it was played out. And it didn't take into account people who were chronically suffering, like Jean Touchant and Nicole Gladue. So track 2 took care of all that. Creating this track 2 of applicants meant that you had people whose natural death was not reasonably foreseeable, but they still complied with all the other criteria. They were suffering unbearably and in a state of decline. They were over 18 and they were cognitively intact. But Bill C-7 was an amendment to the criminal code that allowed for this track 2. So there's all kinds of criteria now for track 1 and track 2, but to make it easy for you, I'll just tell you that track 2 patients are in the vast minority. They're less than 3% of everyone who has MAID. The vast majority, by far, are people whose natural death is reasonably foreseeable. But for those few whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable, they have to wait 90 days from the time that they're assessed until the time that they have MAID. They have to wait 90 days. And this is called a reflection period in case they change their mind. So we have these two tracks, one for people whose natural death is reasonably foreseeable, and track 2 for people whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. Let's look at how the whole process of MAID rolls out. Well, first we make an initial inquiry, and when a person asks their doctor or nurse practitioner about MAID, as I mentioned, that clinician, doctor, or nurse practitioner is obliged by law in Ontario to give them information or send them somewhere to get information. And that might happen if the doctor themselves or the nurse practitioner doesn't support MAID for religious reasons or ethical reasons. What happens after that? Then the person must fill out a written request. They must fill it out themselves. They must say that they want this. And if they are filling out a form in Ontario, it's usually called a clinician aid A form, and it must be signed, and it establishes your credibility. It establishes the criteria that I outlined before, that you're capable of making this request, that you understand all the options available to you, including palliative care and any other options that will relieve your suffering. And if you're unable to sign it because your hands are not working or you're just not able to, then a third party who meets specific criteria can sign it. And then comes 2 independent assessments by clinicians, doctors, or nurse practitioners who's had special training in MAID, and 2 individual assessors will come in. They'll meet with the patient and interview them, examine all the medical records, and decide whether they meet these very stringent criteria for all that I mentioned before, irremediable medical condition. And only when they both agree can you move ahead with the assessment. Can you move ahead with the MAID procedure? Once the procedure is scheduled, the MAID provider will pick up the drugs that are necessary, and they'll bring them on the day that MAID is to be administered. Prior to administering the drugs, the person receiving MAID is asked again for their final consent. Are you sure you want to go through with this? And it's okay to say, I changed my mind, right up until the end. The agreement, the consent can be verbal or nonverbal if they can't speak. If consent is given, or if it's been waived, drugs are administered for a very quiet and peaceful death that's not at all painful and takes about 10 minutes. Death is pronounced and a death certificate is issued. And on that death certificate, there won't be anything written about MAID. Your cause of death will be the disease that you're suffering from, whether it's cancer or ALS or Huntington's or whatever disease you have. That's what will be written on the death certificate, and it doesn't influence life insurance. If you want to read some stories from from family members, on our website, Dying with Dignity Canada, we have blogs with wonderful stories that talk about how this process is a very peaceful process, and it's very dignified and respectful. I'd like to introduce you to Audrey Parker. In 2018, Audrey Parker lived in Halifax. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, and ultimately that breast cancer metastasized to her brain. And she applied for medical assistance in dying and was approved. She was losing her capacity. She wasn't thinking clearly. She knew that because she had cancer in the brain, it was going to go down very fast. She wanted to have one more Christmas with her family, but she was afraid that if she waited until after Christmas, she wouldn't be cognitively intact, and she wouldn't be able to answer any questions at the very end. She wouldn't be able to give consent. So she chose to die earlier than she wanted because of that reason. And the legislators realized, as did Audrey herself and her family, that there was something wrong with the law. And so in Bill C-7, they introduced Audrey's amendment, which means that if you apply for MAID, like Audrey did, and you're approved, but you want to delay it for a period of time, you can waive final consent. In other words, you can say, I approve now, I want to go through with it, and I want to go through with it in 1 month's time. And if at that time I can't give consent, I'm giving it now. And so that's called a waiver of final consent. There's been a lot in the news about medical assistance in dying, and maybe what brings you here is that some of you have read all about it and you have questions. So there was a parliamentary review recently of Bill C-14, and there were 5 main issues focused, and they made many, many recommendations, and I'm going to summarize them here, but suffice to say right now, currently the government has no intention of making any changes to the criminal code as it relates to MAID. MAID for people with mental illness has been extended until March 2027. And that was a very hot and contentious issue. We believe it will go forward, but not until March of 2027. Advance requests, I'll speak about in a minute. Eligibility of mature minors. There is no action expected to be taken on this recommendation, although mature minors are able to make decisions with regard to consent and refusal of life-saving medical treatment. Right now, extending MAID to mature minors has yet to be approved. Protection of people living with disabilities, not on my slide. The Canada Disabilities Benefit Act was passed in 2023, and the action by both the federal and provincial government in this area will be ongoing. The Joint Committee recommended that the government work to reduce poverty and to support the financial security of people living with disabilities. And the state of palliative care, $30 million has been awarded to promote palliative care over the next 5 years. But let me say a few words about advance requests. The important thing for me to tell you is that it's not currently available in all of Canada other than in Quebec. So what happened? How come it's available in Quebec and not anywhere else? Well, the Bloc Québécois, who are the government in Quebec, decided that they were tired of waiting for the federal government to approve advance requests. 83% of all Canadians want the approval of advance requests. So the Quebec government introduced legislation in their province that said, we will not prosecute any doctors who are performing MAID as a result of an advance request. We won't prosecute any doctors or nurse practitioners who are going to assist people after they've made an advance request. That's clearly in defiance of the federal law, but Quebec has moved forward and said that that's what they're doing, which has thrown a bit of a curveball for the rest of Canada, because maybe other provinces will similarly legislate for their own little province what they're going to do with regard to advance requests. That's not the best process. Dying with Dignity Canada would like to see that the federal government come in and have federal policies across all our provinces and territories with regard to advance requests, so there's some uniformity across the country. But that hasn't happened as yet, and we're still waiting. And this is hot off the press. This is very, very recent. So right now in Quebec, they are accepting advance requests, and doctors or nurse practitioners will perform MAID even if you're not cognitively intact at the end as a result of your advance request. But nowhere else in Canada are they doing that, because they would be prosecuted. In summary, here are a few takeaways. MAID is a legal end-of-life option in Canada for those who qualify. It's fully funded by OHIP. It's a compassionate end of life. It's safe. It's not a simple process, but it is a rigorous one. And the oversight and regulation of the process is embedded in a trusted and tested framework at the federal and provincial levels. In other words, we're very strict about who gets MAID and who performs MAID. There has never been one case of any provider who's been taken to court. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the more we participate in writing the end of our own story, the more satisfied we are with the arc of our life. MAID allows for planning. It allows you to be in the place you want, surrounded by the people you want, maybe your pets as well. The food, the music, however you want to have your last time on earth. It's been described as very comforting and very peaceful. And now I'm going to introduce you to Irina, and I'll let you hear her very short story.
My parents moved into a retirement home shortly after Dad's 90th birthday. They adjusted, but over the course of the next 2 years, Dad was in and out of the hospital 11 times. Nonetheless, it was my mom who died first, peacefully during her morning nap. We worried about Dad, but he was a strong, independent man, and he rallied. He soon started going down to his meals each and every single day. He went outside to talk to friends and to the gym every single afternoon to work out. We thought he was going to be fine. And then COVID struck. Suddenly he was relegated to his room. We couldn't come to visit. He was isolated. But he got through the winter, and summer was promising. We could take him outside, go for picnics in the park, to my sister's for a barbecue. And then fall came along, and the second wave of COVID struck. And again, he was relegated to his room. And this time it was worse because his health was failing. His hemoglobin dropped really low, and he was admitted to hospital for 5 days. It was an awful experience for him being abandoned there. And when he came out, he begged us never, never to send him to the hospital again. Nonetheless, his health continued to deteriorate. His body was swelling. His kidneys and his heart were failing. And so discussions about end of life started. I was looking after palliative care, but my sister started to research medical assistance in dying, which was my dad's far preferred option. She found information online, spoke to knowledgeable people, we signed all the forms, and found witnesses among friends. I distinctly remember my dad speaking to the MAID doctor and saying, "I've lived my life. Now I want to join my wife." And so the day came. We lit candles. We had a guitar strumming in the background. And we brought in photographs of deceased relatives and my mom. All of those that had passed on and were waiting for Dad on the other side. We asked him to tell us World War II story one more time. And we told him how much we loved him. He'd been a wonderful husband, a good father, and a great grandfather. We loved him. He was our hero. A strong, independent man that always been in control of his life and now in control of his death.
Medical assistance in dying doesn't result in more deaths. It results in fewer people suffering. At Dying with Dignity Canada, we believe everyone has a right to a good death. This has been one of 4 presentations we offer. Dying with Dignity Canada. We offer end-of-life options, advanced care planning, medical assistance in dying, which is the one we just had. And our latest, newest one is called 7 Keys for Navigating a Life-Changing Diagnosis, which helps people navigate the medical system when they've been diagnosed with a life-altering diagnosis. So thank you for your attention, and I'm going to turn it over to Ginny now, who will take your questions.
Thank you, Bina. What a wonderful presentation. And I just would like to open this up for your questions. If you have them, just raise your hands. And Sequoia will make it available for you to ask your questions or pop them into the chat box. But while I wait to hear from you, I will just tell you some of the common questions that we have. Bina mentioned that a number of people ask us what impact MAID has on your insurance. And as she stated, it has no impact on your insurance for the reason she gave, because your cause of death on your death certificate will be the medical problem that you presented with, such as cancer of the lungs or whatever, but it won't, MAID will not be mentioned. Another question that
We have
Sequoia-
we have a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to address that now or if you
Sure,
want to.
let's
Yeah.
go with that. Let's
Okay.
go.
Okay, great. I'll read it out. How has the system adjusted for those suffering with Alzheimer's, dementia, or Lewy body dementia?
So that was going to be the next thing I talked about. And it's a common question. It's very poignant. So MAID, when you are diagnosed with dementia, and I do not believe there is a differentiation between the Alzheimer's, the Lewy body dementia, although I would think with Lewy body dementia, you probably are more likely to have a foreseeable death than perhaps other types of dementia and Alzheimer's. But what is recommended in these cases is that as soon as you are or your loved one is diagnosed, and while they still have mental capacity to learn about MAID and make decisions for themselves, they should approach their GP and ask what their options are. And once they are told their options, it's recommended that they should probably not delay it moving forward too long, because if they have not been assessed for MAID, and then they have the right to sign a waiver of final consent, so that if and when they make the decision to proceed with MAID and establish a date, and they've signed the waiver of final consent, they will be able to move forward. Now, how long do they have? It's often a decision between the provider and the individual who's going to receive MAID. But from my experience speaking with a number of providers, and you can see these presentations on the Dying with Dignity website, they generally won't go much beyond, it's 6 months is an average, up to, there's 1 or 2 providers I've heard say that they would go up to 2 years, but that would have to be reviewed with the provider themselves. So I hope that answers your question about dementia.
Great, thank you very much. I had something, there's no other questions that I can see here, so I'll just come up. I'll give you something that came to mind. Speaking about my mother, she had dementia, Alzheimer's, but was not, her 3 daughters, myself included, we were well aware of the fact way long before she was diagnosed, or by the time she was diagnosed, I feel like she'd almost would have not passed an assessment for capacity. So I don't know if doctors do that with an intention, I would imagine, to protect the person and still give them full, like a diagnosis.
Sequoia, it's a really good point, and that's sort of why we encourage people to proceed as soon as possible so that you can, one, inform your physician that this is your intention. And to your loved ones, let them know your practitioners, and you can start the process. But if it goes too long, that either the individual doesn't recognize that they have a problem, or their loved ones are hesitant. They don't want to acknowledge that there is an issue. Then you may well end up without having the capacity to give consent. And it is only like in your case, it's only your mother that could have done that. So this is where our advanced request comes into this, and it's so important. And we do recommend that if you agree that this would be important to have advanced requests approved by the Parliament, we recommend that you go on to Dying with Dignity Canada, and there are letters that you can send to your MP and MPPs advocating for their support in this very important topic. But it's a good issue. Yeah, it's an important issue.
Thank you.
Some people want to know, where is MAID performed? There are, it can be performed in a number of places. Your home. There is a facility called MAID House, which is out in Mississauga, where you can book to have the procedure performed. Did you want to say something, Bina?
No, I agree with you. I agree with
Yeah.
you. It could be performed at MAID House, which is a
Yeah.
wonderful procedure, or in a hospital. Most hospitals, not some religious hospitals.
Yeah. And that was the next issue, is you might be able to have it done in a hospital or in a hospice or in a palliative care facility, but wherever you end up, you want to clarify that they will allow for MAID to be performed in that organization. And further to what Bina was talking about, in some religious-based facilities, they will not allow you to have MAID, although this is another point that Dying with Dignity Canada is advocating for, to change that permission. When facilities are funded, publicly funded, we believe that they should not have the right to deny this. I see, where is MAID House? MAID House is out in Mississauga, and I don't have the address on the tip of my tongue, but you can find it. There's a lot of information in the Dying with Dignity Canada website on MAID House, and you can go onto the website and just Google it. You ask also, Lisa, you're asking about the mental capacity, that it may start to decline beyond the 2-year period. That's fine. But as soon as it starts to decline, you want to intervene quickly. Going back to the Audrey Parker's story, where she was concerned that she would lose her mental capacity to give permission for MAID, her final permission for MAID. That's what you got to keep in mind and act accordingly. But if the mental capacity, such as Sequoia's mother's, if her mental capacity starts to deteriorate, this is when you'd want to intervene with your mom or your loved one and say, should we proceed? Would you like to proceed with being assessed? And we'll set up, and that will start the process to set a date, and again, either sign a waiver of final consent if death is anticipated, is reasonably seen to be occurring in the future. This, there are other ways, other options that as you are facing your end of life decisions, there are options that you might want to be aware of, such as a do not resuscitate request. If this means you wouldn't have cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And if this is something that's important to you, then you need to go with your physician. You need to fill out the form, have it approved by your physician, and then in discussions we've had with EMT providers, they want you to post that on your fridge so that when they come in to your apartment, if they're called in, they can see that you've signed a DNR and they will not do CPR on you. It's also when you complete that document, you are assigned a number, and the EMT or physicians will look up on the DNR catalog to find out what your number is, and recognize that you do not want to be resuscitated. Other options are to you might want to have voluntary ceasing of taking food or drinks or medicines. You may opt for palliative and hospice care, as we've already talked about. Any other questions? By the way, about the advanced care planning, which you've already heard about, I'm not sure whether you were all on that one, but you can access an advanced care planning kit that's been developed and revised recently by Dying with Dignity Canada, and that's available on our website. And that's just a great tool to have, but something that you have to complete, keep up to date, and share with your family, friends, and healthcare providers. Anything else?
Well, thank you so much for this great presentation, Bina and Virginia. It's not an easy topic. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge today. And
Thank
I
you.
want to add one more thing about power of attorney. Power of attorney is separate from advanced care planning. And the power of attorney is something where you personally can add into your power of attorney a handwritten request for advanced request, stating that if when you are approaching your end of life, you need an advanced request is deemed to be legal, you would like to have made. However, the problem is sometimes these power of attorneys don't get read. Well, often they're not read until after you've died, and then it's too late. But lawyers will not add an advanced request to your will because right now it's not legal.
so would you recommend that you go over all of the document with whoever it is that you have assigned power of attorney to, so that they're fully aware of your wishes?
Absolutely. And it's something you'd put into your advanced care plan, because that is something you review with your loved ones before you die.
Remembering that advance requests are not legal right now in Ontario.
Yeah, remember that is critical. Yeah. There's a question here, how do we access the other DWD educational presentations?
I'm sending them to Sequoia, so watch for her advertisements wherever you found this one, and you'll find the others.
Yes, we're always planning way far ahead, so we've already finished our planning for January, February. So, but I think Advanced Care Planning Day is in January or February, and I do believe,
I believe it's April 16th.
oh, is it April? Okay. So that will definitely be coming. I think there's somebody on my colleague Ruth wants to run that around that day. And I would definitely like to run the 7 strategies for navigating the healthcare. I forget the name of it.
Yeah, 7 keys for navigating a
7 keys.
life-altering diagnosis. Yeah.
That would be great if we could run that in March, April. I have every intention of doing that. I'm a little bit restricted on what I can do based on what other people are doing, and we have benchmarks that we have to not exceed. So, but some of these presentations, would they be available also on your website or
Not currently.
not currently? Okay. Yeah, so we're going to do our best to definitely offer those in the near future. So keep an eye out for those.
And how many did we have today, Sequoia?
We had 8.
Okay, thank you. And thank everybody for their attention.
Thank you
Regards.
both.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Virginia.
Bye.
Bye, Bina. Bye, everybody.